So our next question is really, what is a right? And I think it's a definition that people take for granted that they know, but they don't. If you ask lay people often what is a right, they will tell you it's something that I just have. And to some extent that is true, and to some extent that is not true. We have inalienable rights. We have rights that require somebody else to act in order for us to realize, and we have other rights that we need somebody not to act in order to realize. But looking at what a right is an entitlement to be treated in a particular way, or an entitlement not to be treated in a particular way. It comes from a recognition of your humanity. So we need to then understand what the history of all of this is. And what we see is way before we talk about constitutionalism, we can talk about the Cyrus Cylinder. The Cyrus Cylinder was drafted by a conqueror named Cyrus, who was around in about 540 BC, 530 to 540 BC, who, after conquering a certain group of people, declared that all the slaves were free and that all people were equal by virtue of them being human beings. Also, freedom of association, freedom of religion. These are some of the great sources, the great rights that we get from the now called Cyrus Cylinder. And it is the bedrock of the history of rights. The Cyrus Cylinder then takes its own journey in terms of not the cylinder itself, but the rights that are imbued in the Cyrus Cylinder takes its journey through Greece, where their philosophers recognize that people act in a certain way without having written laws. And this leads to the concept and the jurisprudential philosophy of natural law. And I know that many of you, after having done jurisprudence, consider yourself to be natural lawyers, which is great. And natural law tended to be trumped by rulers codifying written laws that infringe natural law. And once it was written, it sort of the natural law went by the wayside. But there always seemed to be a return to the natural order of laws. Understanding people's humanity, the wish to have freedom of religion, the freedom of to be considered equal, freedom of association. Again, we might want to regard that all men were considered equal and perhaps women were not considered the same level, and this is to come later. But the genesis of the recognition of equality, the recognition that we all have a common human lived experience, which means that we bleed the same, we ache the same, we want the same from each other. And this is really the origin of rights. But this is the origin of first generation rights. Now, first generation rights are the rights that the state must refrain from doing something in order to ensure that these rights are realized. So, right to equality means that the state must not have laws that create inequality. Freedom of association, the state must not stop us from interacting with each other, must not ban religions, and so on and so forth. So this is the basic history of rights. But getting back to the bottom line of how do we define them, we define them as entitlements. These entitlements, if infringed, can be challenged. And especially in the case of first generation rights, these challenges would be against the state, who has a duty to ensure that we have the full use and enjoyment of our rights. So, in practical terms, if there is a law that says only green-eyed people are allowed to eat cheeseburgers, then everybody who is not green-eyed would not be seen as equal in terms of their entitlement to eat what they want. Or only black people cannot vote, all people who are not white cannot vote, as was the case during apartheid. this is a true indication of a violation of natural rights, of human rights, because there was a very, very basic view that people were not equal. Now that we have a constitution that recognizes, not gives us, but recognizes our human rights, specifically first-generation rights, we would be able to challenge laws that infringe our rights, specifically equality, association, expression, and religion. So this is a very brief little introduction on what rights are, well, what first-generation rights are in terms of their historical context.